Sorry about that. Looks like you've caught me gaming. Well, gaming is really important to me. But there's some other stuff that's really important to me that's kind of related to gaming. And since it looks like you're already here, I'm going to go ahead and have a conversation with you about it while you're here. So go ahead and take a seat across the table. Let's have a talk about gaming criticism and my anecdotal relationship to it. It's a beautiful Sunday morning here in Martinez, Georgia, and there's a pretty loud car passing by, but I've already done 4 or 5 takes of this same clip, and each one of them gets more and more awkward. So let's just bite the bullet and start now. So, and I've got my script here. So let me tell you a little story. In about 2009 or 2010, my mom bought my father an iPod Touch for his birthday that he did not use very much, but me and my siblings ended up using a whole lot. Why is this iPod Touch important to gaming criticism? Well, it's kind of a roundabout thing, but I'm sure if any of you have grown up with YouTube, then you will kind of understand what I'm talking about. But let's start at the top here. In about 5th or 6th grade, which is when we got this iPod Touch, me and my family had a Nintendo Wii. Me and my brother both, and my sister, had our own Nintendo DSs. And we had plenty of GBA games and some DS games, and not a lot of Wii games. So that was kind of the console lineup in my household. My mom wanted us to stick to Nintendo because she thought that was the most family-friendly video game brand. And honestly, she's kind of right in hindsight. So why do I mention all this? Well, to me and my family, value was really, really important when it came to video games because we did not have a whole bunch of extra money to spend. And so every kind of game that we bought was really, really, it was a very important and specific choice. Sorry about this dog barking. But this is not a sob story. We were like a lot of middle class or lower middle class families at the time. You know, you wanted to partake in video games and you saw people partaking in video games, but you couldn't partake in all the video games that you wanted to. So what do you do when you decide that you're going to buy a video game for your child? Well, you think about the most recent feature film that you guys watched together, like Meet the Robinsons, and you bring home the video game tie-in to it. That was the experience that me and my siblings had to endure for a little while. And I do appreciate my family's want to appreciate our hobby and support it. But, you know, that's, as a parent, you end up buying a lot of video games that are pretty bad, especially in the era of the GameCube, the Nintendo GameCube, sorry, the PS2 and the Xbox, where kind of the market of video games thrived in a huge way commercially. It was looked at as the next final frontier. And it didn't end up working out that way, and a lot of video games that were really bad that came out just as tie-ins to commercial things like movies are dead now. They no longer exist in the way that they used to, because the video game market has kind of consolidated. It's no longer this darling that it used to be, but it is continually gaining money and value. But you have to be a lot more strategic about how you do it. Consumers are thinking this way now, and so are developers and publishers. But at the time, consumers didn't really have a lot of the tools that they do now to sort through video games. But what was kind of coming into fruition at around 2009 and 2010, at least for me, was this idea of video game reviews. And how did I find video game reviews? Well, I used to watch plenty of YouTube videos about video games, and I still do now. But at the time, I watched them all on my family's iPod. And this thing contained the world of power to me. I could look up any video game and have a review of it pulled up right then and there. And I didn't really understand what video game reviews were at first until it took me a little while. But once I realized that I could find out a lot of specific information about video games just by looking up the game and typing in review afterwards, and I could learn about the general quality of many games that I could never own for myself or never play. It was an eye-opening and kind of world-shattering experience to me. So I kind of started this whole video game review thing on IGN, of course, because they still do have the highest SEO when it comes to any kind of video game reviews. So at the time, there was a lot of games that I did not own that I really did want to own, but I wasn't sure how good they were, or I wanted to just know more about the games themselves. And so what I would do was watch certain videos, like, for example, IGN's review of Super Mario Galaxy, which I'm sure is a video I've seen many, many times now. It's videos like these that would kind of help me know what games I wanted over which games I didn't want. And they were really influential at that certain point in my life. I would just consume these videos increasingly just because they would provide, there was so much information, like this entire game packed into one less than 10-minute segment. And it was kind of addicting to me to watch a bunch of video game reviews because I couldn't own all those video games. And a lot of the times I wouldn't even intend on buying them. But it was just very fascinating for me to learn about what games were coming out and what people thought about those games and whether or not they were worth purchasing in the first place. All this information was really eye-opening, and I really did appreciate being able to partake in it. And so I started with IGN, and I watched some IGN reviews, and I watched some GameSpot reviews. GameSpot was still pretty big at the time. But slowly I started to find more and more niche reviewers for stuff that was more applicable to me. Because IGN couldn't review everything. There were just too many games coming out. Especially for the Nintendo Wii, which was kind of dealing with the kind of end of the video game boom for commercialist people. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the Wii was such a successful console that it was almost like the Atari 2600. There was all kinds of shovelware being shoved onto the system just because of the fact that so many people owned a Wii that if you put a game out on the Wii, you had a better chance of increased sales. At the time, I feel like that was the mentality that people had. So there were a lot of shitty games on the Wii, but I owned a Wii, so I wanted to know about the shitty games on the Wii. I just wanted to know about the games on the Wii in general. And so I diversified my review watching outlets to very specific reviewers that kind of covered a lot of the shovelware on the Wii. Those included Neverchris and this guy called The Wii Viewer, who used to review games with his kids. He was great, and he's still around, too. Neverchris is not. But these two people, I used to watch their reviews just because, again, I was curious about what was coming out of the Wii. I would go to the fucking Kohl's with my mom and see just all kinds of shitty games on the shelf, and I wanted to know what they were about, and that's kind of where I found all the information out. So with these two reviewers, I started to diversify the reviews I watched as well, because Neverchris had a lot of reviews about anime, and he also had a podcast. And these two particular outlets of video game coverage were very influential to me, because from the podcast, I was able to kind of get a more holistic idea of the reviewer that I was watching. And so when I would watch him review a game, since I had listened to a lot of his podcasts, I would know a lot about his specific personality and what he liked and what he didn't like. So his reviews were highly valuable to me because I was able to compare my own interests and my own preferences along with his and be able to get a clear idea of whether the game would actually appeal to me. Because I know where I lined up with him as far as what he liked and what he didn't like. This is Neverchris specifically. But there were two reviewers that kind of followed. They were in the mid-period of my review watching experience. Those are Total Biscuit and Some Call Me Johnny. As I say these names, they sound more and more insane, but they were definitely a lot more palpable when I was a middle schooler. Now that I say them and I'm in college, it's kind of insane. But Total Biscuit, who, God rest his soul, he's no longer with us, was a fantastic reviewer because he would also cover, even though he would do quick segments on games that just recently came out, he would cover things and also talk a lot about his own feelings on the industry, often on his YouTube channel. And that was kind of where, this is kind of the progression from my little tiny feet to like growing into like walking on two legs and then like, you know, flying away, like evolution of me as watching reviews. Because Total Biscuit was my introduction into the industry as a whole and like what were the issues that were affecting consumers in the video game industry. And Some Call Me Johnny was just a fantastic reviewer because his personality is amazing. And he's still around and he's kicking and doing very good. But he's definitely more of like a general fan reviewer and not, his reviews don't have a lot of substance, but his personality makes them very enjoyable to watch and fantastic pieces of content in themselves. And this is kind of the point where I was so deeply entrenched in video game reviews that they were becoming like almost games themselves were becoming secondary to me because video game reviews were free and I could consume them without worrying about value. And so they were such an addictive form of entertainment that sometimes I would watch more reviews and videos about the industry than I would about games themselves, just because it was so easy to watch a YouTube video versus sitting down and actually playing a game. Kind of going down the line of the progression of video game reviewers that I watched, it slowly turned to game reviewers that are a lot more buttoned up and people who have a lot more strict and specific ideas about what a review is. So we move on to people like Yahtzee Crosshaw and Matthew Matosis, who are both still around and both not really American. And these two reviewers are incredibly detailed in their analysis, very to the point. Yahtzee himself is an incredibly great entertainer, and Matthew Matosis is probably the best analytical personality when it comes to video game reviews today. And I highly recommend watching his videos. These are just like some general ideas about video game reviews, and kind of looping back around to IGN and GameSpot where I started. These people try to appeal to the greatest common denominator because their videos have the largest audience. And so this kind of pigeonholes them into being overly simple a lot of the time, and having their reviews be incredibly short for the people that will watch them, that they don't have to invest a lot of time into doing so. The ultimate step in my progression was finding Giant Bomb through Total Biscuit, which is a website that focuses on game coverage, but is entirely personality driven. And with the conversation about video game criticism and where it's going now, I think that personality driven websites have a huge advantage, because it's hard to retain people in video game coverage and video game criticism. You have to have a personality. You have to have people need to know who you are for your reviews to be effective, honestly. Because IGN has, again, they appeal to the greatest common denominator because they slap a score on their games and they move on from there. And people, especially even parents, can just be like, wait, Super Mario 3D World, is it good or is it bad? And they go online, look up Super Mario 3D World review, and the first thing that pops up is IGN's review, and it has like a 9.0, and they're like, oh, it's a pretty good score. I guess I'll get it for my son. It's good to you can see why they're still influential. But I move on further and further to more and more personality-driven review content until I get to Giant Bomb, which is kind of the crystallization of that, in my opinion. They have a very successful and great video game podcast that's easily got to be the best one I've ever heard. And I've heard a decent share of video game podcasts, probably more than most people. And so they do a really good job of explaining to their audience and demonstrating who they are specifically. And so when you go into a review and you know who's reviewing it, you know that person's likes and dislikes. But all this entire process isn't arduous because it's entertaining from top to bottom. They make their video game content pleasurable to enjoy because you feel like you're sitting on the couch chatting with your friends about video games. And that's kind of why I'm doing this video now too, because people like them give you the confidence that video game criticism is something that can be more in its own way, its own separate thing from movie criticism and from any kind of other media criticism. They make it very personal, and kind of Roger Ebert and other movie critics kind of work at doing stuff like that. But these guys are not super professional, and they're not super buttoned up, and they don't have this degree of professionalism that locks them and pigeonholes them to a very specific type of content. Instead, they do their own thing. And so that's kind of the ultimate crystallization of video game criticism now, is that it's ultimately personality driven, and that's what you have to be successful. But that's also why it's so good. And that kind of brings us to, this content is essentially valuable in and of itself because of how entertaining it is. This brings us to like people like Video Game Donkey, who are incredibly successful for his personality, for his humor. But he also criticizes other people who do video game reviews all the time too. But I think that one of the things that people like him miss out on, and people that in general criticize video game, we're getting a little meta here, but people who criticize game criticism in general, and game journalism in general, is that they don't understand that these people have a lot of pressure on their backs. They're not just chatting with their friends about games, and they're not just reviewing shit for their friends for any totally random reason. They're actually doing their jobs, and their jobs are to cover games in an effective way that will be commercially viable for them as a whole. And so I feel like a lot of the times people don't realize the value in game criticism because we overlook it. We think that we take it for granted, really, because who else is going to do it if not the press outlets that get a lot of coverage? Well, they say, well, just ask your friend or form your own fucking opinion. But then we return to people like me who grew up having to consider the value in a game a lot. I played a lot of Pokemon as a kid just because $40 got you like 120 hours of content. That's why I think I grew to love that franchise so much, because it was so cost effective as far as game time to actual cost of the game. I've changed in my opinions on games in general as I've become to get my own purchasing power and my own ability to buy games for myself and not have to rely on my parents. But game criticism is helpful to people who have to consider value in games. It's obviously shouldn't be the only consideration that critics take into account, but that's why it's valuable to people. That's why it's important, because not everybody has the ability to buy and play whatever game they want to. A lot of the time they have to make choices, and that's the reality today. People are always making choices based on value, and game critics really help the people in the lowest common denominator decide what games they want to play and what games they don't want to play. People like me who grew up with a 3rd gen iPod Touch watching fucking 50 YouTube videos in one day about random ass Wii games like Mad World that they'll never buy, gained a lot from watching game criticism, because I learned a lot about games in general, and it was all free content. Not only that, I was able to help decide what games I thought would be the greatest for me. One of the greatest games, my favorite game of all time, is Cave Story, which is a freeware game on PC. But I wouldn't have never found that game if it wasn't for Neverchris. But that game was the experience of playing that game was so influential and so important in my life. But I never would have found it if it wasn't for game criticism. That's why I still highly value it to this day. And I think that's people oftentimes take it for granted or miss the value of game criticism because they have their own purchasing power and they don't have to worry about value in games. But there's a lot of criticism here and there about game criticism in general. This is a very meta conversation. But at the same time, I think that today, I hold that it really is important, especially to people who don't buy a lot of games. And we often miss out on that and what game criticism is and why it should be important to consumers. That's my story. That's my long and forlorn tale of game criticism that's very convoluted. I'm going to get back to playing Rhythm Heaven on DS. Everybody have a great day. Thanks for watching my video.